Greetings to you all, fellow patriots, friends, and colleagues from across Zimbabwe and in the diaspora. Today we have, as expected, a very good turnout. Already we're nearing 200 persons already in the room for this Zoom discussion on a very pertinent subject, the Stampede towards the 2023 elections is history about to repeat itself again in Zimbabwe. We raised the question against the backdrop of disputed elections over the last 20 years. I recall in 2013, as an example, that the summit in Maputo, at the end of which the MDC, Morgan Tsvangirai and his colleagues, were called separately into a room and warned against entering the elections in 2013. It's water under the bridge, but I think it's pertinent for two reasons. One, that Zimbabweans appear to be averse to risk when it comes to elections. Already, everybody is getting ready for elections, regardless of the risks. Secondly, the region appears familiar, not to mention the international community, with this history of disputed elections. And when the warning was given out by the leaders, heads of state in 2013 in Maputo, it was almost as they were familiar with that it had been going on in previous elections, with their own observer missions, SADC observer missions, entering qualified reports after every election. So the question about the history of elections in Zimbabwe, the history of disputes following every election, the record of violence that accompanies, has accompanied almost every election, calls us to ask the question of both ourselves as Zimbabweans and the region. Are we going to allow it to repeat itself? So that's the question before. And to help us today, very able moderator, Chris Manoleng, a global advisor and executive director of Global Governance Africa. Chris is a very educated young man, an eloquent broadcaster, a graduate in Master of Arts in International Relations. He's worked in the media, ENCA, SABC. We met him during the 2013 elections when, with his team, they were housed at Upper's Trust. So we thought no better person than Chris to come here and moderate such a hot session as we have, and also thereby add a regional dimension to the Zimbabwean narrative. We have among the most eminent of thought leaders as panelists in Jonathan Moyo, needs no introduction, former Minister of Higher Education, Higher and Tertiary Education in Zimbabwe, and Professor Arthur Mutambara, an eminent scholar, our robotics professor, we call him. He needs no introduction, the former Deputy Prime Minister during the GNU. And there were a host of discussants. Fadzai Mahere, Desina Mkoko, Alex Magaisa, Tendai Dumbuchena, Dewa Mavinga, Job Sikala, Sikamai Bere, Denizuru Jethro Mpofu, and last but not least, Siku Mashingaidze. These will help us in this discussion. So with those few remarks, I'd like to call upon Chris Manoleng to take over. Chris.
Thank you so much. Let me start off by thanking Dr. Ibo Mandaza and indeed the SAPES Trust for putting together what I believe is a much anticipated and certainly very necessary webinar that will look at the question of the electoral landscape and indeed elections in Zimbabwe. As the title says, Stampede to the 2020 elections. Is history about to repeat itself? I think before I hand over to our very distinguished panel, that includes two professors, Professor Jonathan Moyo, Professor Arthur Mutambara, I'd like to make maybe a few observations that might act as a conversation starter for our webinar today. And certainly in the concept note that we shared as part of the invitation to this seminar, the point has been made that it appears that nothing seems to divide Zimbabwe and lead to violence, bloodshed, and in many instances, international condemnation than elections. And indeed, when we track this phenomenon, as was noted by Dr. Mandaza, our convener, in his opening, we note that in 2000, the election was rejected by the Commonwealth Observer Group. And in 2002, it led to Zimbabwe being suspended from the Commonwealth itself. The election in 2008 led to the imposition of an inclusive government, which seemed at the time, and even with hindsight and historical perspective, not to have delivered the kind of democratic outcomes that we would have anticipated. And of course, most recently in 2018, there was another election that seemed to be nothing more than an attempt to cure what appears to have been a coup in Zimbabwe. This also has led to international condemnation in recent times. But the interesting aspect about this is that since the end of British colonial rule, and when we observe Zimbabwean elections since 1980, it's interestingly kept its obligation to hold regular elections, which almost negates the question that is raised by our convener, which is that of, are we seeing history repeating itself? Because in many instances, history says that Zimbabwe has indeed held elections on a regularized basis.
No.
One of the sticking features of this is, however, that ZANU-PF appears to have used multiple strategies to manipulate these elections and remain in power, despite the creation and emergence of a popular opposition in the movement for democratic change. So in this instance, by looking towards elections again in 2023, are we not simply setting up Zimbabwe for the sort of condemnation that has emerged from these elections, the electoral manipulation that has been what appears to be the stock in trade, in particular, of the governing party, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, and the use, of course, of coercion in the form of violence, very cleverly engineered electoral manipulation in recent times has been noted. And I think the exclusion of rural areas as an active area of competitive electoral politics, with what might be seen by some to be controversial points around elections in Zimbabwe, I'd like to hand over to Professor Jonathan Moyo to allow him to give us to provide us with about 25 minutes of his observations and opening remarks. This will be followed by Professor Arthur Mutambara, who will also be given similarly 25 minutes. And then we'll give our discussants 5 minutes each to respond to the panel today. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your very provocative remarks. It's tempting that I start by responding to you, but I will not follow that temptation. May I also thank SAPES and Dr. Mandaza for inviting me and for hosting this regular platform, which is contributing immensely to state politics in our country. Chris says that I have 25 minutes to make my observations, but the conveners gave me 30 minutes. You are already rigging the panel. Well, the question is a very timely one. What I'm not sure about is whether the aspect of a stampede is visible. I don't think that there is any stampede towards election 2023. In fact, what we see in the body politic is palpable fear on the part of ZANU-PF and Douglas Munzora's MDC T, two major players in the formal sector. A serious fear of elections. I mean, they are afraid of by-elections. If you see a by-election, certainly you will be double afraid of a general election. So there's some question about the stampede aspect. However, the part which I think is the more important part as to whether history is about to repeat itself is timely, is very serious, and I think it is the most serious question. And I don't think the question is whether or not Zimbabwe has been formally holding elections when they are due, but whether when Zimbabwe holds elections, it holds free and fair elections that with a result which is accepted by all, if it's not the majority of the participants. That is the question. Is history of election rigging about to repeat itself? And I think this question is best answered by looking at 10 key variables, 5 which speak to the background of the elections, where we are now. Are there features, development in the body politic, which if we look at them, give us concern that history might be about to repeat itself? And then I will also proffer 5 electrodynamics which accompany or usually accompany every general election. And I will suggest that there is a need to focus on those dynamics because how they play out will, to a very large extent, determine whether history, if not about to repeat itself, will repeat itself as we get into the active part of the election season. So I start with 5 very important background variables, which I believe are very important to determine this question of whether history is about to repeat itself or it will in fact repeat itself. The first one, obviously, an important starting point, has to do with the illegitimacy of the state. And the illegitimacy of the state arising from 3 aspects of the state, key aspect of the state. It is common cause that the 2018 presidential election produced a disputed result. And then I believe, and I say so as one of those who actually took a careful look at that election and studied it, that we can say, as we sit here, that it's a fact, a documented fact. I know some of our citizens have a problem with a proven fact, but it is a documented fact that the 2018 presidential election was stolen. Now, if you are about to go into another election against the background of a stolen previous election unresolved, nothing having been done about that election, then it stands to reason. It's rational to say the possibility of history repeating itself is very high. But not only do we have a legitimacy crisis, a crisis of legitimacy engulfing the executive arm of government, but also the judiciary, even presented with compelling evidence. The judiciary chose to look elsewhere and endorse what was an irregularly conducted election by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, and left the judiciary in crisis. And the judiciary has gone deeper into that crisis by its involvement in the party politics, the politics of the major parties, MDC and ZANU-PF, notably through the controversial and dubious 31st of March 2020 Supreme Court judgment, which had two implications that clearly affect whether or not the next election will be history repeating itself. One, that judgment inexplicably ordered the restructuring of the MDC Alliance and the restructuring by holding an extraordinary Congress in 2020 on the basis of 2014 structures to elect the successor to the late Morgan Tsvangirai. An incredible kind of judgment that today restructure yourself on the basis of yesterday. It's a very difficult politics. But as we have seen with the development around the constitutional court decision on constitutional amendment number 1, that judgment, which sought to restructure the MDCA, has also had the consequence of restructuring the third arm of government, which has previously not been part of the wrangles, the political wrangles of the day, as we are now seeing. That is Parliament. The judgment has been used to effect recalls, which recalls have resulted in the restructuring of the composition of Parliament, so that the ruling party, which did not have 2/3 majority to make constitutional amendments, finds itself with that 2/3, thanks to the judgment in general, and in particular, the support of that judgment by the MDC T. So this now, it is without question that what is happening in Parliament, what is happening in the judiciary, at the behest of the executive, will determine whether history will repeat itself. If we look at it today, objectively, clearly, history is about to repeat itself. Second, what will determine this issue will also, to a large extent, depends on who controls 3 Fs. The politics or the political economy of Zimbabwe in general, but electoral politics in particular, are influenced by 3 Fs: food, forex, and fuel. And who controls those 3 will, to a large extent, influence the or decide the important question of the 2, namely whether the election will be history repeating itself in terms of rigging. And this is particularly important this time round, because while traditionally these 3 Fs have been controlled by the top 4 counters in the Zimbabwean stock exchange, Old Mutual, Delta, Insco, and Econet, EcoCash, now they are controlled by cartels, which have emerged since the coup. And all the cartels are very much connected with the state and ZANU-PF. The third background variable, which I have already alluded to, is that generally in terms of the law, the election is a rule-bound political process which ends up as a legal event. And because it is a legal event that is supposed to be conducted in terms of the law, starting with the Constitution and of course, then the Electoral Act, the outcome of an election is presumed to be valid. And it's whoever thinks that it has not been so, who has the burden to prove otherwise. But Zimbabwean elections since 1980 have always had a disputed outcome, such that now an important presumption that must accompany any and every Zimbabwean election until there's a fundamental change is the presumption of rigging. It is rational now to presume that every general election will be rigged because previous elections have been surrounded by allegations of rigging. And when we look at the 5 dynamics that are very important, which look at the election itself, what will define it, I will point to 1 or 2 very critical areas that those who are participating in the election need to look at. But the last, which is the 5th background variable that is very important for us to look at and is currently very active, is the consequence of the coup, the consequence of the military coup. The 2013 election, the major background variable that affected that election was the 2008 election and the GNU government. The 2018 election, the major background variable that shaped it was the coup. The 2023 election, the major background variable that's going to shape it are the consequences of the coup. And in particular, with respect to 4 things that are now playing out in the body politics of the country. Number 1, a major consequence and a very serious one at that of the coup has been the depoliticization of the public sphere, as it were the depoliticization of politics. There was quite some robust, very active political participation in the run-up to the coup. Zimbabwe, in the run-up to the coup, was a laboratory for real politics. After the coup, there has been a very systematic program by the state, in particular by the securocrats, to shift politics from the everyday engagement and contestation to a security-driven process where now fear grips the nation. And what the state prefers is that the citizens become apolitical or even non-political. Everyone must now be a good citizen, and the idea of a good citizen is what you find being prescribed in the impending, soon to be gazetted, patriotic bill. The state does not want citizens to engage in political life. The state does not want citizens to exercise their political rights, and political rights being the most fundamental rights that informed the struggle for independence. Also, related to that has been the demobilization and immobilization of the opposition in general, but the MDCA in particular. This whole issue about the Supreme Court judgment, the recalls, attacking not just parliament, but also councils, taking away the funding that the MDC is entitled to constitutionally by virtue of its performance in the 2018 election, taking its head office and targeting certain activists within the MDC or associated with the MDC. All that is designed to demobilize them politically and render them unable to act, and therefore immobilizing them. You cannot rationally project a free and fair election against the background of a demobilized and immobilized opposition. And this is being done not by ZANU-PF. This is being done by the securocrats in terms of their job contest, but in particular, this is being done by the CIO. Mnangagwa is not an army guy. He tries to present himself as a soldier, but he is actually a CIO guy. CIO is his politics, and the use of CIO to demobilize and paralyze the MDCA is active, and therefore raises concerns as to whether this will not facilitate history to repeat itself. But because of demobilization, we also see now a major consequence of the coup, which is that ZANU-PF is no longer a political organization. ZANU-PF is absent from the political scene, conspicuously absent. And no one in ZANU-PF is doing or saying anything of political significance. They are traumatized. I have said they actually are behaving like people who are in a trauma center. They are not behaving as politicians. And it is very instructive to look at what is happening in ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF structures are conspicuous by their non-political activity. And this is a direct consequence of the coup. And lastly, the civil society has been paralyzed by the coup. One unfortunate consequence of the coup is that the civil society is in hiding. It is in a state of paralysis. Partly it's because there was a mobilization of everybody during or in the run-up to the coup, but partly it's because that's what happens in a military state. If you want to see the evidence of Zimbabwe as a military state, look at how the civil society is engaging, look at how the ruling party is engaging, look at how the state has systematically attacked the opposition, and all that adds up to a depoliticized state. Now, against this background of these 5 variables, which in my view are the best indicators as to whether history is about to repeat itself ahead of the 2023 elections, we need to look very quickly at the elections themselves, at what defines the election. And there are 5 dynamics that are very important if we are going to have a meaningful debate on this one. First of all, and these are parts, if you will, you can look at this as parts that define an election. First of all, you have the pre-election period. When you get into what is the pre-election period, you start a pre-election campaign. And what are the 2 major benchmarks of the pre-election campaign? The most important one is voter registration. On the 9th of December 2020, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission announced publicly that it had started what it called a massive voter registration exercise. And you know, what was underlined in that message was massive voter registration exercise. And then it said it has started that massive voter registration exercise in order to prepare or commence the delimitation exercise. That is the delimitation of constituencies. We had expected the delimitation to be linked to the census, and we know that is not going on. So ZEC, in fact, is in charge of both the delimitation and on the basis of a voter registration exercise. Now, if you look at the major platforms that express politics in Zimbabwe, you will not get the impression that there is a massive voter registration exercise going on in Zimbabwe. And yet this is very important for the next election. Whether or not that election is going to be free will depend in the first instance, whether we have in fact had an appropriate voter registration exercise, and in particular, how that voter registration exercise has affected the delimitation process. There's quite some reasonable grounds to be concerned that certain provinces, and certainly those in Matabele land, are at risk of losing constituencies. And the excuse that will be used will be the voter registration exercise. Some urban constituencies are definitely going to lose constituencies, or some urban areas, urban towns, centers, are definitely going to lose constituencies to rural centers under the guise of voter registration exercise. Now, what is the most important issue there? The most important issue is, of course, the voters' role. And an election, when all is said and done, is a voter's role. He who controls the voter's role decides the election. It is quite instructive that while this has started as we speak right now, you don't see the kind of political opposition party and civic society and others participating in the exercise to get people to go and register to vote. Yes, we are seeing quite some interesting and I would say helpful messages on social media platforms, but they are not really very useful if they are not connected to what is happening in the streets, the blocks, and what is happening in the villages. The voter registration expresses itself at a polling station level, the polling station-based voters' role. And unless somebody begins to come up with a voter registration campaign that ties all the noise that we are hearing with what is actually happening on the ground, then observers should have good reason to fear that history will repeat itself. Because the one thing that the state has succeeded in the negative sense of the term to control and manipulate is the voters' role. And the opposition up to this point has not shown the capacity to understand the implications of the voters' role. You've got to start focusing on the voters' role now, the voters' role for 2023. You don't wait until the voters' role is closed and you are invited to inspect it, and then you start making noise. You should actually have your own parallel voters' role with the number of people you expect to come out. Then the next thing which is very important is the election campaign that is coming. The election campaign starts when the nomination court sit and approve candidates as well as election symbols and so forth. Now, a lot of people in Zimbabwe, political parties in particular, wait until that time. When the voters registration exercise starts right now, you should also anticipate the election campaign. And the most important aspect of that election campaign is the selection of candidates. Political parties that wait for the nomination court process to select a candidate assist in the materialization of the fear of history, the fear being expressed by this topic of history repeating itself. Because then they would have missed a lot of stuff. What it means in the Zimbabwean case is you must have 1,958 candidates for local authorities. They are very important. You must have them today and start organizing around them, because if you have 1,958 local authority candidates today, you are covering the whole electoral map. And that is the most important part, because that is where the V11s are generated. Those are the people around whom you can start building other capacities. Those are the people you can link to resident associations, burial societies, community-based organizations, village communities and village committees and so forth. If you wait for the nomination court to come up with your 1,958, then you've missed the boat in terms of your own ambition to win an election, but you are also contributing to the possibility of history that has been witnessed over the last 20 years, repeating itself. But you also must have your 210 MP candidates, especially if you are opposition. And I dare say, especially if you are MDCA, one thing that can be done to get Monzora to run for his money right now, and other people who are entertaining remaining with him, especially sitting MPs, is for the MDCA to start saying it is now working with communities to select candidates for constituencies. It's very, very important. And if you have those candidates for constituencies as well as for local authorities now, as opposed to when the nomination courts sit, you will have played an important role. Third, you must focus on voting, the voting period, voting days. And there's lots to do there, but the one important thing that must happen now, which has implications on the voting day, is the creation, not the selection, but the creation of polling agents pool, a pool for polling agents. It is impossible for any opposition party anywhere in the world, let alone Zimbabwe, to win an election without competent polling agents. It's just impossible. This idea of waiting until the nomination court sits, waiting until donors start telling you how much they have for polling agents, and you end up just picking fly-by-night characters, and you even end up not being able to fill the polling agents in a number of constituencies, is very problematic. We know that in 2018, there were 10,985 polling stations, and each one of those polling stations needed at least 4 polling agents. And we know that many of them, at least 500, did not have, for the MDC that is, did not have polling agents. And when you are in that situation, the securocrats, they laugh, they go and buy their whiskey, they say, Zedu Zaita, Zafamba, Basatarova, and they will start looking at those particular polling stations. We saw some very funny stuff that was happening in Makoni North, for example, where there were no polling agents, and ZEC people, or people who were wearing ZEC regalia, were sitting under trees filling V11 forms on their own and putting them in the boxes. So that is very, very critical. The next thing in that chain is vote counting. Now, we really need to pause in this discussion if we are serious about interrogating the question of whether history will repeat itself. I invite you colleagues to pay particular attention to what happens during vote counting. That's where rigging takes place. Zimbabweans, at least those I encounter who talk to me on Twitter and so forth, keep asking me, if for us to take you serious, show us how elections are rigged in Zimbabwe. Some say that, others say, Joyce Mjuru, Ditmas Mtasa, Rugare Gumbo, Sevia Kasukwere, Joao, Jonathan Mo, you left ZANU-PF but a long time ago. But we think you have not left ZANU-PF, and the evidence of that is you are not telling us how the elections are stolen. And they say that expecting that somehow there are some mafia-like, movie-like ways that are used to steal the election. No. One of the things that has happened in Zimbabwe over the 20 or so, or rather over the 40, quite frankly, years, but over the last elections, the studies, I started studying elections in Zimbabwe in 1985 with Professor Masipula Stole. There has been no election that has not been surrounded by allegations of rigging, even when the competition is not stiff as happened in 1995. None. The system has been learning, moving away from certain obvious ways of intimidation, like that stuff of a car getting crashed and saying, this is one way to die, another way is to vote ZANU-PF. Those things are less and less. The deep state among the securocrats are perfecting it, and the major focus of ZEC rigging is in vote counting. And you need to look at two things. There's one thing they call, when they count the votes after they have sorted them out, the valid ballot and so forth, and then it's now serious business, and they know which candidates are there. What they do is they start by saying, we will now put your votes. You will have a pile here for you and a pile there for another guy. Then they will say, we will transform these piles into lots. And a lot is 10 votes, 10 ballot papers for you. And then they will say, these lots, we will then transform them into bundles, ballot bundles. And a bundle is 100 votes, which means it's 10 lots. So what do? They will start undercounting votes of the opponents, of the opposition. Instead of having 10, they can, for you, they will put 14, 15. And for the other guy, instead of putting 10, they will put 8, 7. And that's what happens. When we say we want to open boxes, as I did in 2013 after I lost in Cholocho, we would be saying we want to tear apart these lots and bundles. And invariably, whenever you do that, the numbers change. And it sounds mundane, but I assure you this is serious. For ZEC, this is the source of what they call miscounting. And this is the miscounting mischief that they did in Chegutu West. And I'm sure if the ballot boxes had been opened there, I don't know whether they are still there, they would have found more than one vote that was miscounted, because the miscounting is done in the manipulation of lots and of bundles. Now, I'm going to
conclude. Sorry, Prof. Really, we can only afford you maybe 2 more minutes to conclude because you're way over the allocated time now.
Yes, I hope these are two parliamentary minutes. I just want to conclude, as you say I must do, by mentioning something quite important relating to the counting, which is about the V forms. The V forms. There was such a circus created in 2018 about V11s, and an impression created that the election was about V11s. There are 5 different types of V11s. There's a V11, which is an election return for a polling station. It is only relevant for determining a councillor, the winner of a local authority at the ward level. And at the ward level, where these V11s are collected, a new form is generated, and that is a V23A form. And it collects all the results of a ward to determine the winner at the constituency level of the member of parliament. And at that level, the member of parliament's result are a collection of V23As, and the form for that is called a V23B form. And the same V23B form, a different one, is the one that has the presidential election result. It was preposterous that people ran around making noise about V11s, which determine a councillor, when they should have been running around making noise about V23Bs, which determine an MP, but also constitute the result of the presidential election in the constituency. And in terms of the law in Zimbabwe, the election is determined by adding together 210 V23B forms, not a V11. And a V11 becomes relevant if some questions emerge about what is in the V23B form. And you then start going backwards, looking at your V23A and your V11 form. Taken on its own, as we saw, it does not add to anything. And hopefully, when we go forward next time, there will be a shift from V11 to V23. Now, finally, just indulge me just for 1 minute. Where does this leave us? Zimbabwe has democratic electoral laws, but it doesn't have democratic electoral practice. What is important moving forward is to try and find creative ways of aligning political practice with the democratic laws. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for
Thank you so much, Professor Moyo. You really do paint a very compelling case that talks to the legitimacy or questions about the legitimacy of the state. And similarly, some of the components that are required to reform the state away from what you describe as an increasingly securitized state, where politics appears in and of itself to be anathema. Now, given that Professor has painted such a very dire and stark picture of the state of the electoral systems and indeed the electoral space in Zimbabwe, which in essence boils down to what we could describe as maybe the abrogation of the will of the people, we'll hand over now to Professor Arthur Mutambara to give us a sense of what his perspective is. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much, Professor Moyo. Thank you very much, Dr. Mandaza and Sapes, for this opportunity to share with the people of Zimbabwe. I'm going to share my screen right now, and let me know when. Can you see my screen? Okay. So the Stampede towards 2023 is history. Sorry, about.
Professor, your screen is not shared yet.
It's not shared yet. Okay, sorry. Let me quickly.
There we go.
Okay, good. Right, thank you very much for those detailed ideas, Professor Moyo. I'm here to supplement and complement your input. Firstly, we must understand the framework. In what kind of framework are we addressing this subject of the Stampede and the possibility of history repeating itself? What is the dilemma that we have in the country? What is the national question that we seek to address in terms of resolving this dilemma? And also, what are the key lessons from the electoral history of Zimbabwe? Lessons which already have been articulated by Professor Moyo. What should we do to avoid the repetition of history? And we are going to conclude by a way forward. The issue tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is to say to ourselves, what kind of elections in Zimbabwe can resolve the national question. The nature and caliber of our election is what we seek to address today. And to do so, there are three pillars: the matters around election management, the matters around credibility of the vote, and then our laws and our practice of those laws, and the issue of voter registration as a pillar. Then, of course, the nature of the opposition. Which opposition in Zimbabwe is supposed to bring about a resolution of the national question in 2023? What is the nature of our state? The state in Zimbabwe, what is the nature of that state? This is the framework in which we are addressing the possibility of history repeating itself in 2023. A brief history of the rigged elections. You know, the rigging of elections went into steroid mode in 2000. You can see that election there, Morgan garnered 42% according to the regime. Now, Morgan was going through a treason trial, which ended in 2004, and still you got that 42%. That is the history of rigging in 2002. 2008 is a very interesting year. The opposition collectively had 110 MPs against 99 for ZANU-PF, one to an independent Professor Moyo. Then Morgan Tsvangirai, according to the government of Zimbabwe, scored 47.9% versus Mugabe's 43.2% and Simba Makoni's 8.3%. That was the best year for the opposition. Now, if you add Tsvangirai's vote, 47.9% plus 8%, you get 56%. Oh, the opposition would have won. Is that the right interpretation? We'll come back to that subject. But 2008 was the best year in spite of the rigging. It was the best year for the opposition. 2013, you can see the landslide now. ZANU-PF got a 2/3 majority. Mugabe gets 61% versus Morgan's 34%. That you can see now, ZANU has a comfortable victory. Of course, a rigged, comfortable victory. 2018 is not a great year for the opposition. ZANU-PF has a 2/3 majority of 180 after the elections. MDC at 87, MDCA. And then, of course, ZANU lost 3 to death and 1 recall, went down to 176 currently. MDC lost 12 by recalls and 2 by death. So right now we're talking about 176 for ZANU-PF, and MDC, we're talking about we're talking about a loss of 12 and a loss of 2. Now, and then Nelson Chamisa, 44.39%, Mnangagwa, 50.67%, a difference of 304 votes. These are the rigged results. These are the results that we have in Zimbabwe. So we'll come back to these results. I wanted just to flash out so you can see the nature of the beast, the nature of the rigging, and what you can learn from the rigging. And what the regime is also learning. Not only the opposition is learning, not only the people are learning, the regime is also learning from its rigging activities. When you compare 2008 and 2018, 2008 is the best year for the opposition. In 2018, the opposition went to court to challenge the presidential outcome and never challenged ZANU-PF's 180 seats. That was a misnomer, because even if you've gotten the presidency, what are you going to do with it? ZANU-PF will simply pass a vote of no confidence because they controlled parliament. Strategically speaking, in 2018, the opposition should have challenged Mnangagwa's victory and also challenged the 180 seats. This is parliament, by the way, for ZANU-PF, for it to be meaningful in terms of challenging the rigging. Okay, we'll come back to these results, but I wanted to give you a flash of the results. What are we saying? We've had a history of rigged elections from 2000 to now. So what's new in 2023? In 2018, the regime was purely pursuing an activity of curing and sanitizing the coup. 2018 had to be won by any means necessary by the regime. Why? Why would we carry out a coup d'etat and then hand over power to the opposition? They wouldn't do that. What would be the point of the coup? Why would you carry out a coup d'etat in 2017 and then hand over power to the opposition after committing treason? So there was no chance at all for a free and fair poll in 2018. 2018 had to be won by ZANU-PF by any means necessary. They had to cure the coup, they had to sanitize the coup. And so that was a given. 2023, what's new? We are still within the context of a coup d'etat. Why would you think this, the junta, the coup-based government, are they ready now to surrender power to civilians? They committed treason in 2017. Are they ready to give up power? Big question. That's our dilemma in Zimbabwe. With a coup-based government, with a regime that is a product of a coup d'etat, are they ready to allow civilians to take over? That is the question we seek to address tonight. And also, by the way, coups come in twins. Go and see the Queen Ghana when Nkrumah was taken out. Go and see all those coups in Nigeria and Burkina Faso. They come in twins. So the regime is worried that when is the twin coming through? They are worried about a second coup. And so they're doing what we call coup proofing to make sure that there's no second coup. They're doing power consolidation to make sure there's no coup. Though they are victims of themselves, they are afraid of a coup d'etat from within. And so some of those amendments are meant to coup-proof the system. Is a coup-based regime ready to lose power in 2023? That is the challenge. That is the dilemma. That is why people are asking, is history about to repeat itself? With a securocratic state in Zimbabwe, with state-part conflation in Zimbabwe, with a collapsed economy, dismal supply of public goods, with a dysfunctional public service. There's pervasive and systemic corruption in the country. Mnangagwa is involved in what we call primitive tribalism and shameless clansmanship. We are operating within COVID-19, which is hampering and destabilizing the organization and mobilization of people by civic society and the opposition parties. The opposition is divided, it's weakened by the regime, and also self-inflicted pain by the opposition. The opposition, some of it is co-opted by ZANU-PF. ZANU-PF now owns part of the opposition. These are the challenges we face as we move towards 2023. The regime is not planning to go anywhere anytime soon. They are busy coup-proofing, removing internal challenges. The amendments in complementary activities are basically authoritarian consolidation by a regime which is not prepared to go. This is why we are saying, is history about to repeat itself? Why the changes? What we call lawfare, amendment number 1 and amendment number 2. Mnangagwa's eyes are set on 2023. The regime seeks to consolidate power by repurposing state institutions for purposes of consolidation of power. They want a pliant, partisan, and compromised judiciary in 2023. Why? Because E.D. Mnangagwa expects to lose. ZANU-PF has no confidence. They know they're going to lose. So when you lose, what you do? You then rig the elections. And when you rig elections, what's happened? People are going to go to court. So you must have a legal strategy to make sure when they come to court, Malaba will be waiting for you. Malaba has had his term extended on the 11th of May. This man is now vulnerable. This man is now compromised. He's grateful for being a beneficiary of ZANU-PF patronage and largesse. He's now a safe pair of hands to preside over any challenges to the fraudulent elections which are expected in 2023. ZANU-PF expects to lose. ZANU-PF is going to rig. The people are going to go to court, and in court, there will be a compromised judiciary, a blind judiciary, a safe pair of hands in the name of Justice Malaba. That is the legal strategy we see from the amendments. By having unelected VPs, Mnangagwa is not even comfortable in his own party. He wants to undermine his rivals. He wants to control succession in ZANU-PF. He and his clansmen, he and his surrogates, he and his sycophants are the ones who are going to control succession in ZANU-PF beyond 2023. They are foolproofing to make sure there's no coup. Understand this very clearly. It's not enough to rig an election. You must rig and get away with it. You must have an unsellable impunity. So the regime is aware of that. They will rig, but they want to make sure they're able to get away with it by having a compromised judiciary, by having a pliant judiciary. This is a classic case of the weaponization of the law in pursuit of power, authoritarian consolidation in Zimbabwe. What they are doing with amendments, what they're doing with the patriotic bill is what we call rule by law. We don't want rule by law. We want the rule of law. We want constitutionalism. What they are going for is constitutionality, being in accordance to the law, an undemocratic law, an evil law, an immoral law. That's what they want to do. Our law says we do the following: rule by law, change the law to serve your purposes, change the law to protect a rigged election. We want in Zimbabwe the rule of law. We want in Zimbabwe constitutionalism, not just basic constitutionality. Let's understand the framework. Okay. Now, what are we seeing? We are also seeing the deployment of naked violation of people's rights, violence, repression. 1 August, 6 people dead after the elections. The fuel riot in January 2019, 12 people dead. The regime is applying lawfare, weaponization of the law. They're also using violence. They're using death as a tool. They're harassing and persecuting the opposition. They're using violence against the opposition. Many opposition activists, many civil society activists are in the courts. They're also doing more than that. They're taming, they're co-opting, they're bribing members of the opposition. They now have MDC T, which is their own party in the opposition. This is the strategy of the regime, which will lead to history repeating itself. They are engaging in political patronage. They're engaging in systemic corruption. And of course, foundation to all this is primitive tribalism and shameless clansmanship in Zimbabwe. What are we saying? The strategy of the regime is power retention and consolidation at any cost. What are we saying? Elections are an irritation. Elections are an inconvenient nuisance to the regime. But all these, of course, are going to have a devastating impact on the economy. They're going to damage the business environment. They're going to damage both lives and livelihoods. They're going to damage the availability of jobs and creation of new jobs. This is the impact of the strategy. You must understand a bit of Mugabe versus Mnangagwa. There's a difference. Mnangagwa is quick to use force, more brazen than Mugabe. 1 August, 6 dead. January 2010, 12 dead. He has gone beyond Mugabe's record. He's brutal and unrefined, an unrefined dictator, an unrefined despot. What is his strategy? Ask him. Violence works. Use it as a first resort. Don't hesitate to beat them up. Don't hesitate to kill them. Violence works. Use it as a first resort. That's Mnangagwa, different from Mugabe. Lawfare, weaponization of the law, is more brazen than Robert Mugabe. Remember this. Mnangagwa is coming from the intelligence services. Mnangagwa is a CIO, as Professor Moyo has told us. So what does he do? He abuses intelligence resources. They use what is called falsified military intelligence. Falsified military intelligence against rivals and opponents. When you look at the history, Gamma talks was taken out by falsified military intelligence. G40 was taken out by falsified military intelligence. Joyce Mujuru was kicked out using falsified military intelligence. Today, they're using the same strategy, the same modus operandi against the opposition. This is Mnangagwa as opposed to Robert Mugabe. We know Mugabe was a tribalist, but Mugabe had an element of sophistication around his tribalism. Mnangagwa is completely unimaginative. He's a man of limited abilities, a man of limited talents. That's why he's got profound insecurity, which leads to the vices and the methods we've just described. Understand the man Mnangagwa vis-a-vis Robert Mugabe. He's a president who used to be a violent hatchet man for Robert Mugabe. Now he's a hatchet man for himself. So can you imagine if you could do all those evil things for Mugabe? He's going to do more for himself. Mugabe was a subtle and sophisticated tribalist. We don't want tribalism at all, but Mugabe had some subtlety to it. There's some sophistication to it. This one is an unimaginative, primitive tribalist steeped in clansman politics. Zimbabwe is going through a terrible phase. Okay, the opposition. Let me make this one very clear. When we say there must be unity in the opposition, unity is valuable, people don't understand this. Of course, there's the issue of adding votes. Once you divide, you are dividing the votes. So come together so you can build up your votes. But that is the lesser value of unity. The most important part of unity is its mobilizing effect. Oh, the opposition is now united with one candidate. They're going to win. Change is coming. People rush to register. People rush to vote because unity is a mobilizing tool. When the opposition is united, it's not just a question of adding the votes of their supporters. No, it is about creating a mobilizing platform, a mobilizing tool for people of Zimbabwe to believe change is coming. They are united. Change is coming. They're going to win. So you must understand that as the basis for the value of unity. More importantly, when you are divided, you provide what we call plausible rationale for rigged outcomes. No, they lost because they were divided. If only they were united, they would have won. We call that plausible rationale for rigging. Don't give ZANU-PF, don't give the regime plausible rationale for rigged outcomes. They were divided anyway, that's why they lost. If only they were united, they're going to win. Opposition parties, please understand that unity is more than just adding the votes of your supporters. It's about the mobilizing impact of unity. But more importantly, it's about removing the plausible rationale for rigged outcomes. Here's an example. In 2008, Morgan Tsvangirai, 47.9%, Robert Mugabe, 43.2%, Makoni, 8.3%. When you look at this, observers will say, when we add Morgan's outcome and Makoni's outcome, we get 56%. These guys are fools. They should have united. If they're united, they would have won. They're foolish. That is the wrong interpretation. Morgan won in spite of Makoni. Morgan won despite Makoni. But what we did by being divided, we played hostage to fortune. We gave the regime, we gave observers, we gave neutral people plausible rationale for rigged outcome. No, it's your fault, you guys. Only if you are united, you're going to win. But that outcome of 47.9% is not correct. It's now actually common cause now. The regime has told us. After they were fighting each other, they told us the actual results. Morgan Tsvangirai won in 2008 despite the presence of Makoni. But because Makoni was in the game with the MDC M that I was leading, We played hostage to fortune. We provided plausible rationale for rigging. Please, brothers and sisters in the opposition, have clarity on the strategic value of unity. You can win when there are 20 other candidates, but people say, no, you didn't actually win. Maybe you lost because there are too many of them in the game. And of course, you must stop ZANU-PF 2/3 majority. Don't concentrate on the presidency at the expense of parliament. It's nonsensical, it's unstrategic. What do you want to do with the presidency without parliament? Make sure you put resources, strategic thinking, and planning into winning parliament in addition to the presidency. Otherwise, it don't make sense to anybody. Otherwise, you're allowing history to repeat itself. Stop ZANU-PF from getting 2/3 majority. And also, when we win, when you win, don't win by a small margin. If you win by a small margin, it's tempting for the rigger. When there's a small margin, there's temptation to rig. Even in America, my friend Trump, what did he do? I just want to find 11,780 votes. He was talking to the Secretary of State in Georgia because the gap was small, so small. So the despot Trump was tempted to say, please rig for me. But of course, America is luckier than us. They have strong institutions. They have men of integrity. People like Mike Pence, people like the Secretary of Georgia said no. So Trump could not rig, not because he didn't want to rig. It was very tempting to rig because the votes were close. America was served by strong institutions. America was served by men and women of high integrity. Where are our strong institutions? Where are our men and women of integrity? So please, the opposition, don't win by a small margin. It is tempting for the regime to rig. It is easy to rig a small margin. More importantly, you provide plausible rationale for a rigged outcome. Can you imagine if you were to win by 80% of the votes? Mnangagwa gets 20% of the votes. The opposition candidate gets 80%. Even you, if you were the rigger, you're going to have a nightmare. How do you rig from 20 to 80? But if it is close, 52% versus 47, you can play around with the numbers very easily. Let us make it very difficult for the rigger to do his business by winning by a large margin. Opposition candidate must get 80% of the votes. It will be much difficult to rig. The regime strategy is very simple. They want to avoid the runoff and they want a big gap so they can cheapen the legal challenges. They want to do that so they can have plausible rationale for rigged outcomes. We must understand what we mean by unity. Okay? By the way, the regime also learns from elections. In 2008, they gave Morgan 47.9%. They gave Mugabe 43.2%. Obviously, after 6 weeks of holding the results in Mugabe's pocket, they then declare Robert Mugabe has 43.2%. Changirai has got 40%. How dare you say that? Obviously, those numbers are not correct. And of course, then they had to go through a runoff and all that, and then they're forced to, the inclusive government. In 2030, they were wiser. Rigged by a big margin. Mugabe has got a comfortable 61% versus Morgan's 34.9%. You can't challenge that. So they want to reach by good margins. So 2013 was very difficult to challenge. 2018, very close election. But they rigged so they can be above 50, but just above 50. And of course, once you are just above 50, there's room for people to question it. Now, here is the message to Zimbabwe. In 2023, the regime wants to get not just 50%, much more above 50. So that if they have 70% or 65%, they now can say, you can't challenge this. We won comfortably. Was that victory there in 2018 of just above 50 was quite dodgy. In future, they won't do that. They won't make it that close. ZEC will make it much harder. They're going to give themselves 59% so that it is difficult to challenge. Also, they're going to garner and try to get their 2/3 majority in parliament. The regime is also learning from its own rigging. Understand that. And they are going to be waiting for you. What are we saying? Please, my colleagues in the MDC Alliance, you are the opposition. Forget MDC T, forget Monzora. You are the opposition. Don't be arrogant, don't be insecure. Build a massive alliance, build unity in the opposition. Talk to Kosana Moyo and his small little party. Get him off the ballot box. Talk to Maduku and his small little party. Get him off the ballot box. Talk to Noah Manyika and his small little party. Get him off the ballot box. Talk to Jacob Garivume. What I'm saying is, don't be arrogant and say these guys are small. They don't matter. They matter in terms of psychology of the people. They matter in terms of plausible rationale for rigging. Don't be insecure towards Kosana because his resume is very big. Talk to Kosana. Don't be insecure to other people. But more importantly, don't be arrogant. Douglas Monzora, that one is tricky. Talk to him, but that one is a creation of ZANU-PF. So whether you succeed or not, I don't know. But give him the benefit of the doubt and talk to him. But I'm very skeptical because he's a creation of the regime. Why would he participate in the destruction of the regime? Message. Please understand the strategic value of unity. It's not about aiding the votes of your supporters. It's about the psychology of the country. It's about the mobilizing impact of unity. It's about removing the plausible rationale for rigging. So MDC Alliance, you are the opposition. We respect you. Talk to everybody. Don't be arrogant. Don't be insecure. Good luck with Douglas Monzora, but talk to him. Now, the securocratic government is embarked on a very terrible strategy of destroying the opposition, in particular MDC Alliance. They've created their own party, the MDC T, which is both inept and intellectually bankrupt. They also have no social base. Unfortunately, the fight between MDC A and MDC T can only be settled by a national election. We will see whether MDC T can keep those ill-gotten MPs. It has to be settled through an election or by elections, but the national election will be the answer to this. What needs to be done? What do we need to do to make sure that history does not repeat itself in Zimbabwe? We must have political reforms in the country to ensure free, fair, and credible elections. We must understand how rigging is done. That's why Professor Moyo's presentation is very important. Understand the points, the areas where rigging is done, and then come up with a mechanism to undo it so that we can have free, fair, and credible elections. And some of the political reforms might require constitutional amendments. You know, it's very cynical. ZANU-PF is very cynical. We've been calling for political reforms, political reforms. They're doing the opposite. They're creating political reforms to safeguard rigging. They're carrying out political reforms to ensure that rigging is protected. No, we need the reverse. We need political reforms to enable and allow free, fair, and credible elections, not constitutional amendments to enable and safeguard rigging of elections. We have a challenge. The opposite is being done. What we want, the opposite is being done. What do we mean by political reforms? Reforms to improve democracy, reforms to deepen democracy, reforms to expand the democratic space so that we can have free, fair, transparent, and credible elections. We want professionalism, transparency, integrity, and independence in the management of our elections. These reforms, we must work towards them before 2023 so that we can avoid history repeating itself in 2023. All stakeholders must agree and implement this. Implementation is the problem. It's one thing to have a law or have a rule. Let's make sure it is implemented so that we can guarantee undisputed poll outcomes, so we can resolve the perennial polarization due to stolen or rigged elections. We must overhaul ZAC. The structure of ZAC must change. The nature of appointment of members must change. The independence of ZAC must be guaranteed. Let us copy South Africa. Let us look at IEC in South Africa. Let us professionalize ZAC and pick up lessons from South Africa's IEC. The appointment of the ZAC chairperson must not be done by the president. Mnangagwa must not appoint the ZAC chairperson. We must overhaul the entire electoral system. For example, why don't you have 100% PR? All of them, Senate and Parliament, PR. And guess what? The big parties like MDC Alliance and ZANU-PF might not like this one, because big parties are the beneficiaries of lack of PR. But PR is good for democracy. This is why, again, a major emphasis in my presentation is this struggle in Zimbabwe must be owned by civic society. This struggle in Zimbabwe must be owned by ordinary people, because sometimes the political parties have vested interests. So it will take civic society to say, we want 50-50 gender parity. We want 100% PR. Civil society, the women, the youth are the ones who can drive this agenda. And you might have to change the constitution to get 50-50 gender parity. Election management system, transparent limitation exercise. This must happen if we're going to avoid history repeating itself. Media reforms, access to media, campaigns, election environment. Those 5 stages that Professor Moyo spoke about, they require effective reforms. They require media reforms. They require political reforms. And by the way, you might need constitutional amendments to make this happen, or you might just need an ordinary act of parliament. Go figure it out, people of Zimbabwe. But we need reforms to make sure our elections are free, fair, and credible, to make sure that history does not repeat itself.
Professor Mutambara.
Okay. Okay. I'm still on time. I'm still on time. People power. We must make sure that we use people power in addition to lawfare. We can't just stick to the law. We must seek to also ensure that the route and destination of our election results are guaranteed and the fidelity of our results. Okay? We must defend the vote. We must dismantle ZAC. We must make sure that we identify the rigging enablers, individuals and institutions, and also make sure that we deploy agents. Professor Moyo has spoken about this. 985 wards, 210 constituencies, 10 provinces. We must make sure we attend to the institutionalized rigging, which is done by ZAC. What we need to do in summary: massive voter registration, massive voting, and number 3, defending the vote. There's no point in registering to vote if you don't vote. There's no point in voting unless you can defend the vote. Heavy voter registration, massive turnout will make it difficult to rig elections. Okay, and these are the strategies we must carry out, but civil society must be the center of this. And I must emphasize, Chris, this one here, the limitations of law. Don't get carried away by going to court. In the liberation struggle, there was only one case, the Mazimbamuto versus Landenberg, 1969, which went up to the Privy Council, which was challenging the legality of UDI, the legality of Ian Smith. The judges in Zimbabwe said Smith was legal. The Privy Council said Smith was illegal, but the regime ignored it. Thereafter, the freedom fighters never went to court to ask for votes, never went to court to ask for justice. In South Africa, legal action against apartheid in apartheid courts. You can't do that. Now, ED and ZANU-PF have to decide. Are they keen to create Smith and apartheid courts in Zimbabwe? Are they keen to create illegitimate courts, illegal courts in Zimbabwe? If they do that, we are not coming to your illegal courts for justice. We will not go to court when you have illegal courts and illegitimate courts. We will learn from Zipra and Zanla forces. They did not go to court to ask for the vote from Ian Smith. Tongo Gara and Chitepo, Nikita Mangena and Jason Ziapa Paboyo did not go to court to ask for the vote from Ian Smith. The MK and APLA fighters in South Africa, Chris Hani and Joe Slovo, did not go to court to ask for freedom. So if the courts in Zimbabwe are illegitimate, if the courts in Zimbabwe are illegal, we are not coming there. The law has its limitations. I don't know where we're going to go, and I'm not going to tell you where we're going to go, but definitely we're not going to go to the courts which are illegitimate. So we need to make a decision as ZANU-PF and ED whether we're going to make our courts illegal. All these points have been made. We must stop two-thirds majority. We must improve the quality of our candidates, technical competence, proven capabilities, demonstrable commitment, ethical leadership, strategic thinking, a track record of measurable achievements. The opposition must have credible candidates for president and for parliament. Let us spend some time in choosing our candidates. As we conclude, here's the question. Zimbabwe can be made ready for 2023. History does not have to repeat itself. Elections can solve the national questions. However, there's a caveat. Only if a number of things are done in the next 2 years. Is history about to repeat itself? Not necessarily. If we are wrong, it won't repeat itself. We must resolve the dilemma. It is pivotal for civil society to play its role. There's been a discussion about an electoral Sabbath, avoiding elections, cancellation elections in favor of national reforms. Ideal, preferred path, but unrealistic. It's pie in the sky. It's unrealistic to say you're going to cancel elections and have a national transitional authority. In the context of a military junta, in the context of these amendments, in the context of an overconfident junta, the MDCA and MDC Alliances can only be settled by national election. So even the opposition need the national elections. So I want to be very clear on the NTA. Very nice idea, but totally unattainable. There will be no suspension of elections in 2023. There will be no electoral Sabbath to work on national reforms in Zimbabwe. It will not happen. There will be no national transitional authority in Zimbabwe. A constitutional change is required to do that. Do you expect this junta to give you that change? Not possible. National polarization, divided opposition. And also the nature of the NTA. If it is going to be people who are not politicians, I have strong views that even the opposition won't accept it, but they speak for themselves. So NTA is desirable, but pie in the sky, not feasible. I want to make sure I'm very clear on this so we can do the right things about 2023. Let us make sure we have a transparent election management system. Make sure we defend the vote. Make sure we have political reforms. Make sure we register to vote and then vote and defend the vote. The opposition must understand the strategic value of unity. They must understand the importance of high caliber candidates. And this is the end. Lawfare, yes, let us go to court, but we must understand the limitations of the court. Please, corporate lawyers, tell us the limitations of the law. You cannot go to the oppressor's law firm, the oppressor's courts to ask for justice. Zanla and Zipra fighters did not do that. MK and APLA fighters did not do. How dare you think you can do it if this regime has gone wrong? If this regime now wants an illegal government and an illegal court system, we won't go to that court. We must deploy people power. We must work on political reforms. Women, young people must be the center for our discussion. We must have an ecosystem approach. We must be our own liberators. How? Massive voter registration. How? Massive voting. How? By defending the vote. We the people must become the electoral revolution we seek to see in 2023. I thank you so very much for this opportunity to share with you all.
Professor Arthur Mutambara there, giving us a tour de force on what needs to be done in order to move the electoral needle in Zimbabwe. Truly inspiring, sir, and thank you very much for sharing your insights. Also, Professor Jonathan Moyo, thank you for sharing your insights. Just to note, everybody, we've reached our cap on the Zoom meeting of 500, but don't be discouraged. We have a permanent recording of this dialogue on the SAPES Trust Facebook page, where we're streaming live. So you can go there if you've been unable to get into Zoom. You can also jump on the SAPES YouTube channel. Also check out all of the policy dialogues dating back all the way to 2020, where these discussions around elections, politics, the economy of Zimbabwe and the region are there for you to exploit. But without further ado, let me hand over to some of our discussants. And I'd like to invite Fadzai Mahere to come on here and in a very brief sort of space of time, if you don't mind, Fadzai, please join the conversation. And I'll start off by asking you, in your view, what must be done?
Thank you very much, Chris. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to SAPES. I'm here as the spokesperson of the main opposition, the MDC Alliance. I also wear the hat of being a constitutional lawyer. I'm an advocate who practices at the bar. So based on those two portfolios, I do wish to offer some views around what needs to be done. But before I swiftly get to that, I just want to say something about politics and what we value as the MDC Alliance in terms of our political participation. You know, what's happened in Zimbabwe over the years, particularly the last 4 decades, is they removed the people out of politics. If you look at all the energies that are being invested by the state, by the regime, by a lot of politicians, the energies are around tussling for power, the energies around, dismantling the constitution, doing everything they can to repress freedoms, and very little is being done to improve the people's lives. The core thing that needs to be done is to bring the people back to the center of our politics. And, you know, we are, at least in theory, a constitutional democracy. So what that means, if we want to improve people's livelihoods, if we want to make sure teachers are paid, if we want to make sure that we improve the lot of our public health system, modernize our infrastructure, get jobs for the young, and, you know, make sure all people have a pension that's respectable. In other words, giving all Zimbabweans a dignified life, we have to change the political system and the political culture that we have now. So where does that take us? That takes us to a place where, you know, we need to change the regime. And because Zimbabwe is a constitutional democracy, at least in theory, the only way to do that is through an election. Now, that comes to the center of what our conversation is about today. What sort of an election can deliver a Zimbabwe that we can be proud of? A Zimbabwe where everybody is included, where there's freedom, there's fairness, and there's opportunity. And, you know, it's so important that, you know, I emphasize that this is not a question solely for the MDC Alliance, or even just for politicians to answer. It's a question that should be exercising every single Zimbabwean's mind. Every single citizen has a responsibility to ensure that they're engaged, that there's no apathy, and they play their part to ensure that the political space is a political space that's truly representative of the people's interests, that we don't let the executive get away with corrupt, repressive, violent, dictatorial conduct. We've seen, as Professor Moyo said, that ZANU-PF, including its proxies, Douglas Munzora and his outfit, are in panic mode. They're desperate. They don't look like a confident, secure outfit that's ready to take on an election. That's why, as Professor Moyo said, we've seen these illegal recalls, the dismantling of the constitution, and the concentration of power in one person, the drama that's taking place in ZANU-PF, the impending and looming patriotic bill, the arbitrary arrest, the shrinking democratic space, the criminalization of opposition politics, and basic rights are under threat. All of this points to a very insecure state apparatus. And what we've consistently said as the MDC Alliance is that at the core, at the root of Zimbabwe's problems is a legitimacy crisis, and an illegitimacy crisis that stems from a disputed 2018 election. Unfortunately, the illegitimacy crisis is now affecting all other arms of government. We've seen what's happened with Parliament. Parliament is no longer a true expression of the will of the people. We've seen the wanton, illegal recalls and a complete usurping of the will of the people. People were very clear in 2018 around who they wanted to represent them, whether it's in Kuwadzana, whether it's in, all the other places where recalls have taken place. And yet we see the regime blatantly ignoring the constitution, ignoring the will of the people, and just recalling those people, imposing and supplanting their own opposition, something that is not tenable and that we really need to fight against in the coming election and show our displeasure in a very strong way as the citizen. We've also seen the illegitimacy crisis starting to taint even the judiciary. We've seen what's happened in the magistrates' court, where the right to a fair trial is extremely under threat. We already know the current debate that's taking place around the constitutional amendments that affect the judiciary. We clearly have a problem there. And so this illegitimacy problem is what is at the center of the bad governance crisis that we see in Zimbabwe. Everything else, the poor functioning of the economy, the joblessness, the fact that teachers go to school 2 times a day, the fact that, you go to hospital and you can't get adequate basic health care, all of those are symptoms of a deeper bad governance and illegitimacy crisis that we see. We urgently need electoral reforms. There's no gainsaying this, it's already been said by both our panelists. One of the disturbing aspects with ZEC is that there's been no transparency around a lot of the important national processes that are meant to take place. And as the MDC Alliance, time and again, we've engaged them. What is taking place with delimitation? What is taking place with the census process? All of these are key as we, approach 2023. We need to know what's going on here. And under Section 68 of the Constitution, this cannot be a unilateral process. All stakeholders have to be brought to the table. The citizens need to know what's going on, and there has to be transparency, because we don't want these key national processes, delimitation and the census, to be abused to fortify the rigging machinery in 2023. There's obviously, a whole raft of electoral reforms that are required. I think as the MDC Alliance, we've got a separate policy document called Price, which details and catalogs in great detail all the electoral reforms that are urgent and necessary to ensure that we don't have a repeat rigged election or a disputed election outcome that will lead to more illegitimacy problems. But chief amongst these is that we need to look at the composition of ZEC. ZEC needs to be independent, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be free, fair, efficient, transparent, as I said. These are constitutional imperatives. I think Section 239 of the Constitution is clear around what ZEC should be, and we've seen that ZEC is not that. The influence of the military in the ZEC Secretariat is something that needs to be urgently addressed. There are obviously the reforms that are required around the media space. We've seen the reintroduction of the Bodagezi National Youth Service. All of that is created, to gear towards a violent election in 2023, something again that must be resisted strongly by all citizens. So what is to be done? We need to converge as citizens. We all need to come together. And this includes, Professor Mtambara was very clear around the need for the opposition, in other words, politicians to unite. But as far as we're concerned, it goes even further than that. Civic society, the women's groups, the women's movement, the young people, the students' movement, the church, we have to come together and form a broad alliance that's going to really stare dictatorship in the face and resist it and say, thus far and no further. If people power didn't matter, you would not have seen those tanks in 2018. You wouldn't have seen those military tanks in 2019 killing citizens who are trying to demonstrate their constitutional Section 59 right. We would not see the shrinking democratic space. We know that the regime is afraid of what can happen when the citizens and the people come together and say, you know what, this is not the Zimbabwe we want. You know, we want to reclaim the lost Zimbabwean dream and promise. And that's where, you know, all our conversations need to center right now. We know that Zimbabwe is working for just a few people who are in cartels. The economy and the national cake is something that's only being, you know, eaten and enjoyed by a few. But we know Zimbabwe is extremely well-resourced and rich. So we really have to come together. Obviously, there's need for political leadership, and as the MDC Alliance, we don't shy away from that whatsoever. But what we wish to emphasize is that there's a need for all of us to be engaged. Obviously, you know, the MDC Alliance will provide the necessary leadership. The people are very clear in their support, but let's all come together and ensure that we fight together to win Zimbabwe for change. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadzai, for your input there. I think it's important that we note at this stage that we had invited also a representative from ZANU-PF, and that was in the form of Paul Mangwana, who is Secretary for Legal Affairs in ZANU-PF. Unfortunately, at the last moment, he opted to not participate in this platform. However, we continue to call on our colleagues in ZANU-PF to join in this debate because, as you can hear and see, it is of national and crucial importance. And I think that any solution without the governing party right now, irrespective of questions of their legitimacy, makes a solution difficult to achieve. Let me, in the same breath, invite my colleague who is also on the line from Good Governance Africa, and her name is Siku Mashingaidze. Siku, would you like to come in and give us your views on what you think needs to happen in order to move things forward in a sustainable manner in Zimbabwe? Hi, Siku, are you with us?
Unfortunately, I think Siku had disconnected.
It appears Siku has disconnected. So in that case, what we can do is maybe invite in one of our other respondents, if you can pick them up from the floor. I don't know if Justina Mukoko is still on the line with us. Justina Mukoko? It appears that we are struggling to get some of our discussants to join in the conversation as was anticipated. Interestingly enough, I just see popping up on my screen someone who I'm a big fan of because of his deep insight and intellect, and that's my brother, Alex Magaisa. What do you think is the way forward here? What you've heard from Professor Arthur Mutambara, Professor Jonathan Moyo. I'd be keen to hear your view on whether we're taking 2 steps backward and maybe 1 step forward, calling for electoral reform. How is it done? The cohesion of political parties. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Chris. I've been listening very patiently and listening with a lot of interest to the presentations by Professor Moyo, Professor Mtambara, and more lately by Fadzai Mahere, speaking for the MDC. All very fascinating. I think they've covered a lot of ground. They've covered a huge ground, and there's no need for me to repeat the things that they have said. Suffice to say that you know, I'm a big fan of, for those who know me, of Sun Tzu, the Chinese, the ancient Chinese general, in the art of war. I read it religiously. One of the things that he says is that if you wish to succeed, you must know your enemy. If you know your enemy, you are better off in terms of strategizing in how to handle the enemy. It doesn't matter how much you know of yourself, you should at least invest in knowing your enemy. And that's why I commend, especially the latter part of Professor Jonathan Moyo's presentation, where he made some very important revelations about some of the very basic things that ZANU-PF does in order to rig elections. And also Professor Adam Tambara, these are things that we often say that there is this myth that ZANU-PF does something incredible, something out of this world in order to rig elections. But actually, it uses very basic means. You cannot win an election against any political party, especially a deedless political party, when you don't have polling agents. You cannot do that. It's negligent to do that. And unfortunately, the opposition has committed this act of negligence in previous elections, and I'm aware of that. And so it is very important to invest in that. One of the problems is that you wait until the nomination court, you wait until a few months before the election. You are going to see a flurry of activity in the months leading up to the elections in 2023. And whereas in the years or months before, nothing has been happening. I'll give you an example, Chris, of the constitutional amendment that has just been passed. I despair sometimes, a lot of times I have to say, because when this bill was first gazetted on the 31st of December 2019, some of us went down to analyze it, to write it. I wrote 3 very long articles critiquing that bill, showing the problems of that bill. Now, I don't know how many people read those things, how many people sit down to debate those things. So we have had this amendment for more than a year, and it's only in the last few months, last few weeks, in fact, that people have suddenly popped up and started, we should do this, we should do that. It's almost like, shutting the stable doors after the horses have already bolted. And it's unfortunate, it's a tendency that we tend to have. So I would say that what is very important when you talk about the way forward is you have to invest in knowing and understanding the ZANU-PF. You have to invest in knowing and understanding how it does things. Anticipate their next move. That's why, for me, the issue of this constitutional crisis that we have at the moment, the amendment, there are a lot of other things they put in there, the sweeteners, like, keeping the women's quota, having 10 MPs for the youth, that's 1 for every province, which is basically a nonsense, which doesn't do anything to empower the youth. And there are many other amendments which are presented as progressive. But in reality, what Emmerson Mnangagwa wanted was to capture the Constitutional Court, was to ensure that he has done a favor to the Chief Justice, and that Chief Justice is now beholden to Mnangagwa. And he is very cunning in that he waited until the very last days of the Chief Justice's tenure. When he is nearly 70, when he might or he might not get it, and then he gives him. So the happiest man at the moment is the Chief Justice of Zimbabwe. But let me just also point out something, Chris, as I conclude. Yep. That there are also some fissures which we must be observing in the system. And one of the fissures that I would like people to take note of is what's going on in the current constitutional challenge. Right now, we see the Judicial Services Commission, and for the Judicial Services Commission, you must read Chief Justice Malava. They are saying that they don't want one of the judges to be presiding in that case. But not only that, they are also saying that the judge president of the High Court should not be choosing judges to sit on that panel. Now, the judge president of the High Court is George Chiweshe, who would probably have been hoping that with Malala going at his 70th birthday, would also become the new Chief Justice, or at least had a chance to become the new Chief Justice. And now we see these two literally fighting through the proxies. The Chief Justice saying, no, the Judge President, his subordinate, should not be choosing judges to sit in a case which ironically involves the tenure of these people in the Constitutional Court. So I'd like people to take note of that, because it's a very fascinating dynamic of what's going on behind the scenes in the political game. And there are opportunities to be exploited in that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution there. I'm quite cognizant of the time constraints that we're facing, but as I do so, let me try and squeeze in one or two more of our discussants to help us round off this conversation and maybe help us arrive at what we could describe as a logical conclusion. I was wondering if we have Tendai Dumbuchena with us on the line, and maybe you would like to share one or two thoughts on the discussion today as we begin to round it off. Tendai?
Chris, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Thanks, Tendai. Go ahead.
Okay. The problem of being one of the last speakers is that a lot of your points would have been covered by the previous speakers. But I think it's very, very important for us not to dwell on things that we cannot control, right? Like worrying, agitating for ZANU-PF to effect reforms and things like that. That is not going to happen. We should concentrate on our strengths and what we can do to change the situation. Now, the most critical question to ask is, do Zimbabweans fundamentally desire change? And I am convinced that the majority of Zimbabweans want to bring to an end this nightmare of 40 years of ZANU-PF rule. Now, if that is the case, the next challenge is, how do we translate this desire for change into an electoral victory in 2023? And that is the biggest challenge that we face, right? We must focus on organizing ourselves, civil society and the political opposition, right? And we should not take the voters for granted. The fact that Zimbabwe is in a mess will not necessarily translate into a vote for change. That vote must be fought for. Right? An electoral defeat of ZANU-PF remains the only viable pathway to change, a realistic pathway to change. Right? The vast majority of Zimbabweans will support a strategic mobilization of the population if it is driven by a seriousness and commonness of purpose currently absent. The notion that people will vote for the opposition because of the horrendous condition the country is in is a mistaken one. Their vote still has to be fought for. They still have to be canvassed and motivated to register, and on their polling days to vote. We have to articulate an alternative vision of for Zimbabwe, and to convince the people that their lives can positively be transformed in a fundamental way by voting ZANU-PF out. Our focus should be on organization and unity within civil society and the opposition. I am I'm surprised that no one has mentioned the diaspora, because I think if there's one fight that must be fought, and fought very, very hard, if for Zimbabweans in the diaspora to be given the vote. It's ridiculous. Chris, you can confirm this. Ghanaians in South Africa vote during the elections. So do Zambians, so do Malawians, so do Tanzanians. But the biggest group of foreigners in South Africa and Zimbabweans have no vote. It's ridiculous. And I think civil society and the opposition ranks and so forth should agitate for people in the diaspora to be given the vote. So we have to work hard. It is possible. We've seen, history has taught us that governments armed to the teeth, very strong and so forth, have been toppled by a people who simply refuse to be governed by them. And we must harness that desire of people for change to get them to the polls. And Professor Mtambara was very, very right to emphasize this point. There must be an overwhelming vote for change to deliver the defeat of ZANU-PF in 2023. Thank you.
Thank you so much, my brother Tendai. I think it's probably appropriate at this stage to call back the convener of this dialogue, who is still with us, I hope. Dr. Mandaza, are you still with us, sir? Dr. Mandaza? We're struggling to put a spotlight on him. Maybe while we're trying to get Dr. Mandaza back with us, maybe I could invite, as we conclude, and to help me summarize one of the discussants, who is Jethro Mpofu. Dr. Jethro Mpofu, if you're on the line and hearing this, maybe you can jump in now and join the conversation.
Thank you, Chris. I hope you can hear me.
Indeed.
Thank you very much. Yeah, listening to what our good presenters have given us this evening, first Professor Jonathan Moyo and Professor Mtambara, clearly, an uninvolved listener will think that we are talking about a colonial regime that is operating in Zimbabwe. But it's supposed to be a post-independence black and liberated and liberating government, which means that we are dealing with a native colonialist regime. My observation would be that we as Zimbabweans, led by the political opposition in a number of decades, have allowed this monstrous regime to monopolize the reputation for danger and to manage to use fear and terror itself as a political resource that comes to use in every other election. It's important that the Zimbabwean political opposition cultivates the political stamina to be dangerous, to be feared by this monstrous outfit, or else we will continue at every election to be elbowed out through the use of force, gratuitous violence, and the Maoist shootings of unarmed citizens in order to scare the entire population into hiding so that the regime can proceed with its rule with impunity. And I agree with Prof. Mutambara that over the years, over the decades, this regime has been gaining confidence and getting assurance that with Zimbabweans, if you fire one shot, if you kill 5 of them, they go back into their holes and then we proceed with rule. And I agree with Prof. Mutambara again that we need to think beyond the limits and the perimeters of the law, because we are dealing with a lawless outfit. I'll want to ask Professor Mandaza that can we create a platform? Because I've noticed that most people are listening to what Professor Jonathan Moy is saying and alarmed at the gems and at the details of how election rigging has been taking place in Zimbabwe. Why don't you create a platform in the near future where we discuss Excelgate itself as a text and we get 1 or 2 or 3 speakers to flesh it out, speakers besides Professor Moyo himself, and just get Zimbabweans to pick up the details of how elections have always been stolen in this country. In my answer to the question of the day, is history going to repeat itself in the coming elections? Definitely, given that there is no possibility that the establishment has any political will to change its ways. And look at the biographies. Biographies matter. Who are the people that are manning and womaning this regime? And what are their reputations? What have they done? And what has produced them and what have they produced? These are murderers. Start with the way they treat their own. Look at the metaphor of how Solomon Mujuru was treated, literally bribing the men for dissenting. Look at how Chiwenga is treating the mother of his children, literally roasting her alive. Look at how the Mnangagwa family, its friends, and its international allies are monopolizing the Zimbabwean economy from the mines, from the factories, from the farms, right up to taxi businesses, right up to Omalaicha, informal cross-border carriers. This family, its friends, and its international allies want to achieve monopoly. So what do you expect? What form of reform, what positive prospects can you expect from such a collective? So the political opposition, civic society, and the Zimbabwean populace needs to master more political gravitas. What I want to deposit is that ZANU-PF wouldn't be this monster if Zimbabweans did not agree to be the sheep that they are. What these guys are basing their claim to fame in this political landscape is that they went to the liberation struggle. They braved the colonial regime guns, and therefore they are entitled to rule Zimbabwe in perpetuity. What has our generation done? What has our generation braved? We sort of love life more than we even fear death. Mother's milk approaches to politics, the going to heaven approaches to politics, may not be the formula that is going to help us crack this regime. Can I end there, Chris and the collective? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mpofu. On that note, I think it's really appropriate, without even trying to summarize the depth and the insight that we received today, to try and summarize, except to say that what is quite clear is that unity of purpose by opposition and those who would be agents of change in Zimbabwe is required. We also clearly see the crucial need for electoral reforms to be introduced really as soon as possible, in order to ensure that we do not see a repeat of history, as most of the speakers have indicated today. So on that note, let me hand over to our convener. I'd like to thank you for joining us. If you'd like to pick up the recording, please go to ZANU-PF Trust YouTube and indeed Facebook platforms where you can pick up the recordings, and also the other various places, including their website, where you can access a recording of this at a later stage. On that note, I'd like to thank you and wish you a good evening, and hand over at the same time to our convener, Dr. Ibo Mandaza. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. This has been fascinating session. But we're still faced with the problematic that we raised in the topic. Is history about to repeat itself again in Zimbabwe? One of the points which was implied, but not clearly outlined in the discussion so far, has been the extent to which elections and the extent to which they are held every 5 years religiously has tended to legitimize the illegitimate. Now, those elections have become so desperately a necessity for the regime in Zimbabwe to legitimize itself. It appears to me, to the extent that we appear so geared for elections, notwithstanding the dilemma before us, implicitly becomes almost a process of legitimizing that which Jonathan and Arthur Mtambara have outlined in detail. I call this schizophrenia in the Zimbabwean polity. What I call the election industry. The extent to which that frenzy towards elections is also fed by the international community, the donors, where elections become almost an end in itself, notwithstanding the risks that I've referred to and which have been outlined in great detail in the course of this session, not to mention Excelgate itself. On the one hand, we have the historical backdrop of the history of disputed elections. We have a coup government and a securocrat state, and yet expect naively that there could be free and fair elections. We have a decimated opposition, a legislature in tatters, a constitution being torn up. We have, as Jonathan Moya has pointed out, a systematic depoliticization of the population, including ZANU-PF itself. There was a very profound statement and a profound summary of the situation in which we find ourselves. Civil society is immobilized, itinerant at best. And clearly, 2 years away from the elections, it is naive, it's not facile to call for reforms. There will not be any reforms, as Tendai has just said. There is no way there'll be reforms. There is no way that ZANU-PF will allow reforms if reforms are going to make them, to level out the playing field. Impossible. It won't happen. And yet, we have this frenzy, this stampede towards election. So what is to be done? In my view, we have to consider that if elections are going to be held, do we call for UN supervised elections? Chris was right to point out, and someone else earlier, that in a region in which, and in fact a continent in which elections have become a farce, on what basis would you compel the Zimbabwean government to agree to a UN supervised election? Won't. Then you would have to have the same in Uganda, have the same in Zambia in August. It was the same almost in every country that is holding an election. So we can only argue that in the Zimbabwean situation, and this is the point that should be made, we have a peculiar situation. We have a coup government, we have an unconstitutional government, we have a government which is tearing up a constitution, we have a government which will not be given to free and fair elections, and that therefore we must, with due respect to Professor Mtambara, have to consider all options, including the NTA, because the elections are not going to be the solution. 2 years away, they will not be the solution. We must consider how, at the national level, we can put our heads together, as Fadzai has suggested, to create a national consensus, which puts pressure on ZANU-PF to come to a conference table. We must work with the region, the international community, to get a mediation process going, because it's almost predictable that we are going to have war in 2023. that elections will be a war zone, perhaps worse than ever before. Because the guys who are there, guys who seized power in 2017, are not going to give in easily. On that note, depressing note, we have to say that we have to come back to this topic a few months down the line, and perhaps punctuate the next 2 years to elections with discussion of this type, if also to raise the consciousness of the problem that Zimbabwe is. In the meantime, is to thank you all, and to thank all of you out there on Facebook. We have over 1,000, almost 1,500 on Facebook, over 1,000 comments on Facebook. As Chris mentioned, we have reached the maximum on Zoom. It is most engaging. And I have to thank Professor Jonathan Moy, and also remind and thank Jonathan for flagging Excelgate in the background as your backdrop. It's a reminder to those of you still on the platform that the book is available. You can get a copy, much cheaper than it was in the first edition. And we'd like to have a launch of it again, if also because of the currency of that book, given the circumstances before us, given the topic before us. I'd like to thank Chris Manolang for doing us proud today. He showed the extent to which he's so familiar with the Zimbabwean terrain. He could have just been as one of us. And the diaspora there, I'm so glad Tendai mentioned the diaspora. We have about 6 million Zimbabweans out there. You are there, you're a major factor. There is no way there'll be a solution in this country without you out there. And we're happy that our policy dialogues so far, up to 70% of those who participate in these sessions are in the diaspora. We thank you so much. Thank you. Until the next session in 2 weeks' time on Africa Day. Thank you very much. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Tejar. And thank you, Fadzai, Tendai, all the other discussants. Alex, it's good to see you again and hear you. Thank you very much.